Podcast. Yeah.
Welcome everybody to Clang the Podcast, now sponsored by the wonderful people at DRC Shipping. What do their services include, Pete?
So they include warehousing, pick, pack, fulfillment, air freight import and export, ocean freight import and export, road freight to and from all major European cities, and they're pharma specialists. They've also got a specialism in publisher services, so exporting magazines and books worldwide.
Fantastic. For all your shipping needs and the export-import business, DRC Shipping, everybody. Check their website out. Now, enjoy the podcast. Hello, Clangers, and welcome to another episode of Clang the Podcast. Now, you might notice that me and Pete are looking like a couple of little schoolboys, because this is exciting. When we sat in the pub and decided to do podcasts, we had the realistic list of people who we could probably get, and then we had the dream list. And this man was top of our dream list. As a musician, and as Peter's a musician, there are a few people who are synonymous with greatness. And in the world of producers, this man is as high as it can possibly get. So I'm going to introduce him. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll know him. It's Mr. Steve Lillywhite.
Whoa, nice to meet you. Nice to meet you, Pete. I've met you a couple of times before, Smiley.
Wow. Well, we have. Do you know we actually did meet, Steve? And I don't think you remember. I met you at RAC once, about 10 years ago. When Big Country were recording at RAC.
I was doing something because Mike was singing, right?
Mike was singing. So obviously, me being in the alarm, Mike said, "Do you want to come down?" And I remember meeting you, and you were in full Steve Lillywhite flow. So you had your head in the computer, and you met me like this. You kind of didn't look at me; you just shook my hand, right? And I thought that's amazing. I've met Steve Lillywhite. I tell you what, I watched you for about 2 hours, man, and your enthusiasm and just it was incredible. And out of 2 hours, I've basically stolen that for the last 10 years and used it in my studio.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I think enthusiasm is probably my greatest attribute. You know, if I feel confident about what I'm doing, and in fact, if you go and look at there's a U2 book that says U2 by U2. And of course, I just went to the end and looked at my name because I didn't want to read the whole fucking book, you know. But so I went to the bit where I was mentioned, and Bono says, when we first met Steve Lillywhite, he reminded us of a children's television presenter. Yeah, I'm basically like Blue Peter. Here we go, boys. You just take a couple of songs, you go into a studio, and you make a record. And that's pretty much how I feel about it, you know.
I as I say, I've used that, and you know, from my very small dwellings, a lot of the bands I've worked with, like in the enthusiasm and the encouragement. I always try to like find the positive in everything, you know, before I swerve into the negative. You know, start with the positive with anybody in life, and they'll react to you.
But sometimes, you know, you have to tell it like it is sometimes if it's, but I think the great thing, you know, if you're a good producer, what you can do, you know, people say to me, do you ever have arguments with the artist or anything like that? Well, I try not to, because I try to understand when that problem is going to happen down the road. And because I think of my experience, you know, I know how to head it off way before the problem happens. Right. So it's not like I'm just always saying yes. And, you know, I sort of have this ability to know when the problem's going to happen. So I can stop it happening. Because I was talking to someone today about this. I was in studios from the age of 17. So when I started having success, you know, I was only 23 in 1978. But I'd had 6 years in studios, constantly, all the time in studios. And like at that age, no one else probably in the world had been in studio for 6 years. Yeah. So I really felt, and especially in those days, studios were much more Star Trek than they are now. In fact, studios are not Star Trek at all. They're just computers. All the Star Trek-y stuff is in the software, whereas we had it all on show, and it was fantastic. You know, so bands would inherently, after their initial amazement at, oh, I'm in the Starship Enterprise, they would need to be guided more by someone. And I was of their generation, you know, but I'd had the 6 years experience and they'd had maybe half an hour experience. So it was, you know, I acquired this sort of, you know, I'm not an alpha male. I'm not, you know, Smiley, you look a bit like a sort of an alpha male type. Whereas Pete, you're more the sort of sit back type guy. I'm not an alpha male, except in the studio, where I sort of, because I've been in the studio all that time, as I say, 6 years when, you know, I just acquired this ability to sort of run the ship, whether I was saying do this, do that, or whether I was just allowing it to happen. I had this sort of inherent ability to know how it was going, you know. And that's it, really.
I remember, so I read an article recently, which was where you were talking about that time of being when you started as a tape op.
Yeah.
And you sort of like this idea of you wanted to be one step ahead. So you were sat there thinking, well, I think they might want to redo the chorus on this.
That's
so
right.
I'm kind of like, you know, so you're actually, that sort of the enthusiasm levels where you're always trying to be one step ahead of what's going on and you're listening to what's going on, which I think is, you know, I think that kind of ties into what you're saying. And I think that's a fascinating reflection of what you're saying.
I was a tape op in another room, you know, so it was probably the last and one of the only studios ever really that had a separate machine room to the control room. So literally they couldn't do anything on the desk unless I was at my station pressing the buttons. So I had nothing to do, you know. I mean, it was the loneliness of the long distance runner. I would sit there for hours and hours on end, with occasionally a roadie would come in and give me a joint or something like that. But you know, it was lonely, a very lonely job. So I would just have to listen, and I wasn't allowed to talk back either, because even though I was part of the session, I was not part of the session. The session was in the control room. You know, that was where the session was. I never went in there because I had to always be at my station to start the button. So I was very lucky that my boss, knowing this, so I couldn't learn by looking at what the engineer was doing. I was learning like blind almost. I was like listening, but I couldn't see what was going on. So at weekends, I was allowed to go into the studio and take in a band so I could learn the engineering part. Right. Because you know, it was a studio that had a studio hierarchy. You know, you started out as a tape op and then you became an engineer, you know, because in those days you booked a studio, you got the studio, but you got a tape op and you got an engineer and you got all the technical people. You know, we had 11 people working at our studio. It was crazy. You know, I mean, we had to do tape copies and stuff as well. But in general, it was vastly overstaffed compared to what we have now. We had 3 guys in what was called the technical department, right? I mean, 3 techies for fixing the gear. Now, they all went home to Penge at about 6 o'clock every evening. So, you know, so if something broke, there were 3 guys who did this, but none of them were there because they all went home. Oh dear, it was terrible. But it was, you know, I did work with, what was great is that I worked with, like in the morning, we would have something like a big string section. So I learned how to record strings.
Wow.
And you know, because it was a record company affiliated studio, so we would have like Harry Seacombe or Val Doonican, or you know, in the earlier days, Dusty Springfield, which was great. And then in the afternoon, a band would come in, and probably the sort of 2 or 3 famous bands, but I remember Status Quo was one of them, which I learned a lot. I mean, they were fantastic, and I did many hours with Roy Wood's Wizard.
Wow, really?
Which, all those Phil Spector sound-alike records, like See My Baby Jive and I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day, Angel Fingers, which all sounded the same. but they were all, it was just incredible how he recorded. He would literally go in and put an acoustic guitar down and there was no click, nothing. He would just play an acoustic guitar and then double up the acoustic and do 10 acoustics in the Phil Spector sort of sound, bounce them all onto one track or two tracks, and then do the drums and then do the bass and then get the brass in and the cellos, because Wizard was like, you know, because he formed ELO.
ELO, that's right, yeah.
But then he left ELO and formed Wizard. It still had those grinding cellos that ELO were famous for, you know. Yeah. And he had two drummers. We had to record two drummers. And I remember spending weeks on the music, and he never once had a guide vocal. Roy Wood was an absolute genius. I mean, everything was in his head. There was no guide vocal. So I would think 99% of the time, 99.5% of the time was recording the music. And then at the very end, the last thing he did, he went in, sung it, double tracked it, and that was it. And it was done. And it was ready.
Wasn't he famous for like playing the most instruments out of anybody?
Yeah, he was good. I mean, he was a pretty good guitarist. He learned all these other instruments. He wasn't that good at them, but he's a musical guy, and he was lovely. He's like from Wolverhampton, from Stourbridge or some, he had this deep Brummy accent, and
fantastic.
Yeah, it was great, and of course Status Quo were like just a band. You know, I learned a lot about how bands were operating, and they were good fun. But that was my, but at weekends, but I didn't really know what was going on in the control room because I only heard it from my little room. So I had to go, I went in and recorded, this band I took in was a band called Ultravox.
I love that. I love that. It's
just
kind of like this little band that I brought. It just happened to be, it was just
much.
some bloke called Midge.
No, Midge wasn't in the band at this point.
He wasn't in the band at that stage.
This was the first version of Ultravox that had a singer called John Fox.
I remember John Fox.
John Fox, right. Yeah. Quite what they were like a punky Roxy music. Personally, they were much cooler than the Midge version of Ultravox, even though they were not so successful. But and they didn't have a hit single, but they did 3 albums. I did 2 of them, and Connie Plank did their 3rd album. But through them, I managed to they got a record deal, and that was how I got my first ever credit.
Right.
It was produced by Brian Eno, Ultravox, and Steve Lillywhite.
Wow.
Your first credit was alongside Brian Eno.
Yeah, he was great. And the next time I met Brian Eno was on the Joshua Tree.
I was going to say, we'll come to you two in a minute because I'm going to dive in the deep end with you two.
It was about 6 years later. But the great thing about Brian is that he is so brainy, but he's so simple in his concepts. And I was listening this morning to a song off the and I'm doing this filming for something else at the moment, and the guy's filming me listening back to records that I haven't listened to since I made them. And there was a song on the first Ultravox album called My Sex, and I'm listening to it and I'm starting to remember what happened, because this was a Brian Eno thing. He said, cut the drums, because if you listen to the drums on that, there's like a boom, 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 boom heartbeat on the bass drum. But it doesn't go boom, boom every time. And I thought, why doesn't it go? But sometimes it's like, it's not a guy just playing the bass drum. Right. What it was a whole drum kit. And Brian said, mute all the drums and just keep the bass drum. Right. I mean, if you did it now, you would go in to make it like a heartbeat, the same every time. But we didn't do that. We just muted all the drums. So you heard these sort of, the bass drum not being exactly always the heartbeat. Sometimes it was a sort of a little grace heartbeat. Sometimes it was just the downbeat, and sometimes it was the boom boom. So that was the sort of thing I learned from Brian. Take things away, mute things, which very simple ways of looking at music, but.
Are you finding it interesting going back and listening to stuff? Because we had this little discussion the other day, because I was listening to Sparkle in the Rain by Simple Minds, which one of my favourite albums, because obviously it's just drums. And you, bless you, I was kind of thought, in for a penny, in for a pound, I'm going to message Steve and ask him how he got the drum sound, because I'm so connected these days. And bless you, you were telling me about how you were compressing the room and stuff like that. But then you said you went off and listened to it, and you came back and said to me, it's too toppy. I would like to remix it.
Yeah.
Like, what an amazing thing to say of something that's so set in stone. But do you do that a lot, going back?
I've said this before in a couple of podcasts, but I had this sort of, while I was making music, my 40-year stretch, which is a pretty good fucking stretch, I have to say. Yeah. I did have this thing that I would never really listen back to my records, because there would only be two emotions I could have. I could either like it or not like it.
Right.
Because
you can't change it, can you?
You can't change it. Now, if I liked it, there's the possibility I could be complacent. But if I don't like it, there's the possibility I could be uncertain. Now, both complacency and uncertainty are sort of wrong. You want to be able to go through your life and never be complacent, but also never to be uncertain. So those two things, and I was sort of lucky that I never really had to go back and go, where did it all go wrong?
Right.
Where I had to listen back to my records. So I never listened to my records, and I just carried forwards, and then now I'm sort of pretty much retired. I can go back and listen to them, and most of the time I'm disappointed, because
because you've had such a bad run of things. But I get you. I get you, because on a small scale, I absolutely get you. Because when I finish albums for people, I very rarely listen to them back. Once they're done, once they're boxed, once they're mastered, and once they've sailed out to sea, that's it.
Yeah, you're passive. You become you're active while you're making it. You're very active in the process. You're just passive when it's finished. So complacency and uncertainty.
But interestingly, because when because Smiley and I recorded some stuff a couple of years ago, and we were, I think one of the guys, it was Matt Hay, wasn't it, who came back and said, when you do a mix is just a snapshot in time. And that's it. And it's kind of like, and so everything evolves. The way you work, the way you listen to things, the way, everything evolves and develops. So it is just like, when you mix Simple Minds, that was just then and there. If you came to it again, you probably would do it differently.
Yeah.
Yes. But with some wisdom, you can. After I had great success with If I Should Fall from Grace with God, with the Pogues, with Fairy Tale of New York, I did the next album, which was called Peace and Love. Now, this was when McGowan was starting to his voice was starting to get weak, and I remember. And I made a mistake when I was mixing. Because his voice was not sounding so strong, I tried to bury it because I didn't think it sounded good. And in fact, it was exactly the wrong thing to do. I should have, because the voice was slightly weak and not as good, I needed the voice to be even louder so it would own the track. Because by trying to sync it into the music, I actually exacerbated the problem, because something not so strong when it's quiet is doubly not so strong. So actually, I went back and remixed that album when I was living in LA, and changed that. And I was very happy with the results. So yeah, sometimes you can go back, but
as Pete says, they are moments in time. So I'm going to ask you a question, Steve. What was the first? Of all these people you've worked with, and I could list them out, but honestly, people, go and Wikipedia it, because it will save me half an hour. What was the first time that you were, shall we say, slightly starstruck in a studio by somebody? Because some of these names are just so for instance, the first time you worked with U2, were you starstruck, or were you in control and driving the ship?
No, U2 were this little band. At that point, I'd had a few pretty good hits. You know, I'd had XTC, I'd had the Members, I'd done Psychedelic Furs,
Susie and the Banshees.
Yes.
Yep, that's right. And so, you know, I was the sort of name producer, and they were this young band. So no, I mean, but I've always
bad example, U2. Because you were at the front, weren't you?
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
The Rolling Stones, that was, you know, I always say I produced the worst ever Rolling Stones album.
Which part of the Rolling Stones history? Where were you?
The album I did was called Dirty Work. Now, it's the most 80s album cover you've ever seen. I mean, they had the big shoulder pads, and I mean, and there was.
I know that one.
This was the album. It was the well-known album that Mick and Keith were literally not talking to each other. Wow. So my job was as much Henry Kissinger as it was a record producer.
Between Jagger and Richards. Wow.
Yeah. No, I had one of them come up to me going, rah, 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 and then I had to go to the other one. He says, you go and tell him this, you know. Wow. And now I was brought in on that album by Mick Jagger because basically, apparently the story goes that Elton John, who is always on top of the charts, I mean, he's, you know, and the weird thing, the reason Elton's like that is that he's never written lyrics. So he's almost like a fan still of music, you know, because he's like slightly, he doesn't feel like anyone's in any competition because he's never written a lyric. That's my theory anyway. But anyway, Mick Jagger phoned Elton John and said, you listen to the charts all the time. Who is the current guy for rock bands? And Elton, I think, gave Mick a list of producers, and I was on that list. Right. So we literally, I remember we were all flown on a different day to Paris to have a night in the studio with the Rolling Stones, because they basically would work at 1 a.m. through till 9 a.m. So I remember arriving in Paris and bumping into Rupert Hine, who had just done his night with the Rolling Stones, you know. So I did my night with the Rolling Stones, and nothing much happened. I can't really remember what I did, but I got the job, you know. Right. And so I was sort of brought in by Mick, but I realized after about 5 minutes that, of course, the cool camp was Keith. Yeah. You know, so I got very close to Keith and to Ronnie. And it was, I mean, the hit single on the album was a song called Harlem Shuffle.
Oh, yeah.
Which was it was a cover version.
Yeah. It's a brilliant version. Sorry, Steve, it is a brilliant version.
It's okay. There were a couple of other good songs. There was a song called One Hit to the Body, which was okay. But it was, you know, I mean, Charlie Watts, God rest his soul, there was a point in his life where he decided to go to the dark side. And it happened to be on the album that I produced.
Oh, wow, really?
You know, but it really is true. If you say to Charlie, you know, I'm not sure about the tuning on the snare drum, he would go, do what you like. Come in here, do what you like. You know, he would never think about tuning his own drum, but you can do anything you want. I'll just play, you know. So, but yeah, that was, but was I in awe of the Rolling Stones? Probably not. No, I wasn't. I was, you know.
Because you were there on merit, I presume, right?
I suppose so. I'm trying to think. I mean, obviously, I met David Bowie a couple of times. And for me, he was like, you know, because for me, Hunky Dory, that was the album of my, you know, it was whimsical. It was everything a record could be. It made me think. It was just beautiful. And you know, they say you should never meet your heroes. You'll be a little bit, you know. And I remember meeting him a few years ago going, he's a bit too normal. You know, I wanted him to be this androgynous sort of spaceman, half man,
half alien,
half alien type person who I sort of had a crush on, even though. You know, that whole thing that teenage boys have, you know. And he wasn't. He was like, oh, you want a cup of tea, Steve? You know, it was like,
man.
oh, David, yeah.
What was in that ilk? What was David Byrne like then?
David Byrne would never look you completely in the eye. Right. You know, and as Tina Weymouth would always describe David, she would say, well, you know, Steve, David's like he is because his parents never told him anything he did was wrong. You know, okay. So basically it's like he had that thing of everything is my art. Yeah. You know, there's two ways of writing lyrics, right? There's the sort of Elvis Costello, almost Shane MacGowan, you write poets, you know, you write it down and then you go and sing it. Or then there's the David Byrne, Bono, Dave Matthews way of doing it, which is, you know, you go in and you just sing anything that's in your head. Yeah. And with Bono, he even has a name for it. It's called Bongolese. So he'll sing in this sort of language and he'll con you. He'll make you, because he's a great singer, Bono. Yeah. So he'll do this amazing vocal and you go, that's fantastic. And then you try and go, I'm not quite sure what he's saying. Neither is he. So, you know, amazing. Then he has to go and write the proper lyrics, you know. Now, once he'd written the proper lyrics, he then has to sing it as well as that scat
done in Bongolese, right? Gotcha. Yeah.
And Bongolese, he's free. He's like this, but then he's thinking about the lyrics. So he has to be so sure about the meaning of the song. Now, David Byrne doesn't care what this is what he did. He went in and did his scat vocals. Yeah. And then he would just make words out of what they sounded like. And it did, you know, I mean, he had this thing, stop making sense. It doesn't doesn't have to make any sense whatsoever. Wow. So he was, you know, he was great to work with. You know, I did the last ever Talking Heads album, which was
that Naked? Was that Naked?
Yeah, which was a great.
Which has got Blind on it, hasn't it?
It was. Well, I was going to say this is he goes Blind. That's
what an amazing song! If out there in Clang World, if you haven't heard "Blind" by Talking Heads, it's one of the coolest tunes ever, man.
It is good, yeah. And there's another great song called "Nothing But Flowers" that was the single, which had this lovely African sort of beat, and I brought Johnny Marr in to play guitar on it, which was fantastic.
And I was going to come to Johnny Marr now. Yeah. Obviously, the Kirsty MacColl connection with you, which we can touch on at another point. But one of my favourite tracks was Walking Down Madison. That was Kirsty and Johnny, and you produced that, didn't you?
Yeah. It was... Yeah, it's a great lyric, you know, from an uptown apartment to a downtown, you know, from the rats in the basement to
That's right. Amazing song. And Johnny's one of the greatest guitar, like me and Pete.
I did 3 albums with Morrissey, but I was much more friendly beforehand with Johnny because Johnny was a fan of Kirsty. And in fact, when Kirsty and I bought our house in Ealing, she still had her flat in Shepherd's Bush. So Johnny used to come down from Manchester, and whenever he was in London, he would stay at Kirsty's flat. Right. So he would actually, he named her album was called Electric Landlady.
Yeah.
And that's what Johnny named that because basically Kirsty was his landlady.
Amazing.
So I was good mates with Johnny and he would come round my house and play me some rough mixes of if a double-decker bus crashes into us.
Wow.
You know, I mean, and I would hear that. And he was great. I mean, I actually, oh boy, if only you see, some people are great collectors of things. I am not a collector. You know, I've thrown away handwritten lyrics by Bono. But there was this amazing night that that Johnny came round, and I introduced Keith Richards to Johnny.
Wow, that's gone to the top of the chart right there. Well done, Steve.
So there was Keith, Johnny, and Kirsty basically jamming, and I was recording it in our front room. They were basically doing like Everly Brothers songs, you know, and Keith didn't really know who Johnny was, but Johnny was like completely enamored by Keith, of course. And, you know, it was going 4, 5, 6 in the morning, and Kirsty was singing, and they were singing, "Please help me, I'm falling in love with you." I mean, it was just great. And I'm recording it. Who knows where it went? But at one point during the evening, it's like Keith said to Johnny, "Well, let's do one of yours," you know. So Johnny started playing. I don't know if you've ever heard a Smiths song without Morrissey singing. It's like you don't really know what the song is because they are so separate. This is what made the Smiths so brilliant. Is that Johnny's music was like so different to what Morrissey would sing, and Morrissey has no concept of verse, chorus, or anything like that. Right. So, you know, when I was working with Morrissey, you know, was not with Johnny, it was on his solo records, but we would record the music and Morrissey would give us a song title, you know, which was Salivate, you know, a song like "Lifeguard Sleeping, Girl Drowned." You know, it was brilliant, but you don't know what the lyric is, you know.
Amazing.
But then Morrissey would go in and start doing a vocal when we'd recorded the music, and suddenly we realized Morrissey is starting the verse halfway through what we think the verse is, and then his chorus, but it all works, but it's just like he is singing.
But that's the genius, isn't it? That's you take away format. If you can find someone who does that, that's the one. They're the ones that are going to live in the legacy.
I often say this to artists. I am so bored with verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, finish. If you listen to, you know, because I remember when I recorded Days with Kirsty, you know, the Kinks song.
Yeah, genius.
We were like trying to plan the structure of the song, and it's like, well, what's the chorus? It starts with "Thank you for the days," and then goes "Days I remember all my life," and then it goes, and it's just not. You know, it's not a structure that, and I remember With or Without You, it was just this sort of circular thing that just evolved. Yeah. And it wasn't like verse, you know, now it's like, and I think part of that is to do with the looking at music on the computer screen. You sort of chop it into sections. Yeah. You know, but something like With or Without You doesn't have, you know, it's a cyclical chord change that sort of opens like a flower. And that's
it's layers, isn't it? It's literally the same bass line from start to finish, the 4 chords. And it's literally, if you listen to it, it's like every 8 bars, something else comes in, even if it's just a tambourine or something like that. It's genius.
We've talked about this before, but it's sort of like, because Smiley and I have sat in studios, kind of, we've done bits and pieces of writing. In fact, I have a co-write on about 3 or 4 of his tracks on not this album, I think the last one. But one of the things that it's that thing of sort of, we've always had that you can have just the basic, even if it's just the same bass line that goes through it, and then you just build on top and build on top. But I wanted to pull you back to something you said just now, which was quite interesting, which is like, you know, about how it's kind of that cut and paste mentality. And when you look at things on the screen, when did you realize that things in the industry were changing? Because a mate of mine who was an engineer for a long time, he said that in his own words, he said, "I realised it was fucked when Roland from Tears for Fears came in the studio with a laptop and went, right, the new album's on here. What are you going to do with it?"
For me, it was weird because the sort of changeover coincided with my not very successful corporate gig. You know, I went to work for Lucy & Grange and I ran Mercury Records in London. And so I sort of stopped producing for a while. But when I remember getting that job and there was this new digital recording format, because there'd been digital tape recorders before, but they were sort of based a little bit on tape as well, sometimes on digital tape, and sometimes that it looked like a tape record. What was that one? I had one. I can't remember what it was called. But anyway, so I then, so Pro Tools was sort of called Slow Tools because so many producers learnt their craft on the artist's budget, you know, and that's sort of true. There was a period of time where, you know, it was like, wow, you can do all this. And everyone in the studio was like looking at the screen rather than making music, you know. But at that point, I wasn't involved really. I was trying to be a corporate guy. So I never really learnt. I still don't know how to turn Pro Tools on. I bought Pro Tools.
You got someone who does it for you.
I know everything that it does, you know.
Yeah.
But
you just don't know how to turn it on. Brilliant.
I don't know how to turn it on. But I do believe that I still have this. I use my ears. Like take something like auto-tune, you know, which I love auto-tune. It means that you can really allow a singer to do whatever they want. But I would sit there with a copy of the lyrics, and after I'd comped the vocal, and I would say to my engineer, okay, and I would underline each word that I felt needed to be slightly tweaked, you know, and I'd give it to him and I'd say, do that. And he would do it and then say, Steve, look at this. There's this is a little bit sharp. And I go, I don't care. I'm using my ears.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
I don't want to I'm not using my eyes. You use your eyes and you end up with a different result. If you use
I think, Steve, in a kind of modern day world that kind of obviously I'm, you know, working in, I totally agree. I try to use my eyes as little as possible, and I try to use my ears. And when people talk about tuning and stuff like that, obviously the first thing with vocals is like, well, sing it in tune. That helps. I'd rather you sang it again because you're really close to it in that note. So rather than me sticking it into auto-tune, why don't you hit that note? And because I don't want to look at it and see if it's in tune. I want to hear it. And I think you're right. And it must have been hard for you to have to go with technology because you're a man of kind of feeling and ears and trust and stuff.
I didn't feel quite as in control because I was never really an engineer. I actually went from tape op to producer tape op.
Right.
You know, I mean, I still don't really know or care about mics or, you know, or whatever. I'll let someone decide that. I always have a nice engineer. So I'll have an engineer do the setup and get, you know, I'll say I want, you know, room mics here. I want this there, but I'll let him choose the mics. And then, but back in the day of multi-track, I would run the tape machine because I knew exactly what I wanted, you know. So when it was working with a musician, maybe someone playing guitar in the control room, and me, I would sit there running the tape machine and just work one-on-one with the player. Right. So I would go, okay, let's go back, and I would run the tape machine because I was very quick. I knew exactly what I wanted. I said, okay, 3, 2, 1. Punch in now and stuff like that. So, you know, a lot of my work in those days was comping and doing things again. And, you know, even with the Simple Minds record that sounds like a band playing live, not any time did two people play at the same time on that record.
Really?
No.
Wow.
Everything was done separately. Sometimes the drums were done drums separately. You know, on Waterfront, the cymbals were done as overdubs.
Right.
And I don't know about Catwalk, but yeah, it's very trebly, very.
Yeah, you said that, which blew my mind. I found that so funny. So there's a couple of people we've worked with, both of us, which will be interesting to just throw it. So Bruce Foxton, we've both worked with.
Freak.
That's it. You did Freak, didn't you? Amazing.
Bruce Foxton's only hit single,
which was a big hit as well at the time.
It was a big hit. My brother drummed on that as well.
Did he really?
My brother was the drummer in the Members, and I listened to it the other day. It's got the fucking kitchen sink on it, that song. I mean,
I think I've still got the 7-inch somewhere at home, somewhere in my office.
You should go and listen to it back again.
Yeah.
I mean, it's actually pretty good, but you know, Bruce was like, he wasn't sure who he wanted to be.
No,
he
wasn't.
Was like, you know, if you like it, he says, I don't know. I've got no real. He had no opinion about what he wanted to be. But what a bass player! What brilliant!
Yeah, Steve, I'll tell you a very, very quick story. I got him to play bass on one of my songs once, and it was a. He sat next to me, and this run went from like B minor to A or whatever it was. And every time it got to this B minor bit, he would play F sharp, right? And of course, it sounded strange in my head, and I couldn't understand. We got to the next chorus. He was putting all these beautiful little fills in, and the song went to B minor, and he would play F sharp, right? So I got to I stopped it. I went, "Wow, can I ask you a question?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "The track's going to B minor, right?" He went, "Yeah." I said, "You're playing F sharp." He went, "Yeah." I went, "Can I ask why?" And he went, "Because I'm Bruce Foxton." So it got to the outro, and I said, "This bit of the outro, Bruce, would you mind going to a D, please?" And blah 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 blah. And he played it, and he kind of came back to me and went, "That's clever, that." He said, "What made you think of that?" I said, "Because I'm Smiley, and it's my song." The only track he played on, may I say. Another one, I had Terry Chambers in it recently from XTC.
Oh, well,
what a great drummer he is.
Well, I went to see him play. He has a band called XEX.
That's right. That's who we had in, and so he did making plans for Nigel in my studio.
Oh wow, that's so funny!
Amazing! What an amazing drummer!
I went to see him play a little club gig in New York, and the guy who plays, because it's only a 3-piece, right?
Yes, that's right.
And the main guy, the singer guitar, he's really talented. I thought
he's great, isn't he? Lovely man as well. Really nice.
Yeah. I thought he was lovely. The bass player didn't really. I spoke to the bass player, but it was like Terry and what's his name?
I can't remember. I knew you were going to ask me that. He's a really nice guy, and I can't remember his name. So if you're watching this, we love you, even though we don't know your name.
Yeah. And actually, it was great to see Terry. It's like I'm at that age now where I want to connect with some people who I haven't from those days, because, you know, I could drop dead tomorrow. Who knows? You know, and I would like to at least. I mean, I contacted the violin keyboard player from Ultravox, Billy Curry, who I haven't seen in 40 years, and I said, "Billy, can I call you? I just want to talk to you." So we had a video call together, and it was just great to touch base with these old and Chris Briggs. Do you know Chris Briggs?
Oh, I know Briggsy. I spoke to him the other day, because obviously the Robbie connection. He's lovely.
I haven't spoken to Briggs for 10 years, and Briggs was the reason I got sober. You know, and he was, and I just texted him and I said, because Briggs's wife was Kirsty's best friend. You know,
okay.
So you know, I was very good mates with Briggs back in.
He's an amazing man. Amazing.
I mean, I used to do Load of Blow with him, and he's 37 years sober. So that shows how long ago. You know,
I think he's been the catalyst for many people getting straight. Actually,
He's done very well, and I love him to death, and he's great. He buries his dead very well. But all A&R men do, you know.
I'm going to message him after this and tell him that I've done a podcast with you. I'm going to ask you a couple of very quick ones. Can
I, Smiley? Can I just jump in with something, because we sort of like you talk about Bruce Foxton there, and I mean, one of the things that I always joke with Smiley is the fact that, you know, there are 3 people that inspired me to take up the bass: Bruce Foxton, JJ Burnell, Geddy Lee, right? And he's played with 2 of them. I'm waiting for him to get the call from Rush, but I don't think that's going to happen. But I've got a bone to pick with you, Steve.
Yes.
You turned down, and I know you started on bass. Yeah. How could you turn down Grace Under Pressure? How could you turn down working with Geddy Lee?
He hates me. I mean,
really?
you can Google Geddy Lee, Steve Lillywhite feud, And he's even now hasn't forgiven me. It's like,
Really?
No, the story goes, I was supposed, I went to meet Rush and we got on great. And I even went to the studio to look at the studio. And a month before we were supposed to start, I get a call from Simple Minds. This is the circle right here, Smiley, to do Sparkle in the Rain. And I went, oh, Simple Minds. I love Simple Minds. Hang on, I better call up Rush and say I can't do their album. So I called up Rush, his manager, and he went, what do you mean? He said, you're supposed, you said you'd do it. And I go, yeah, but don't you understand? You don't want to shag someone who doesn't want to shag you. And it's like, I don't want to do your album now. I'm sorry.
Wow.
And I mean, I was sort of fearless in those days. But the only time in my life I've been sort of slightly threatened to, you'll never work in the music business again. But it didn't stop me. I said, no, I feel like I have to do this Simple Minds album. Geddy Lee hates me. He said, I'm not a man.
For that reason, Steve, and I'll tell you this now, everybody, I'm never going to work with Rush. All right? So, Pete, get that one into your psyche. That's not the only reason, but I'm just telling you now.
Yeah, but the circle here is that if I'd done Rush, I would have not have done Simple Minds. Yeah. I would not have met Kirsty. I would not have had my 2 children with her. Smiley would not be raving about Sparkle in the Rain. I mean, this
and so many other. The thing with you, Steve, is I've got a really lovely circle of friends from back in the day who are music fans, and I think you've produced all our favourite albums, which is amazing. You know what I mean? So that's where for me the connection, because obviously I know quite a few producers, and I think for me, what was it like working with Beady Eye?
Beady Eye, well, it was one of the only artists I actually approached, because when Oasis split up, I went, I'm not sure if Noel will ever write great songs again. And I was probably right. But I thought, Liam has the voice. Liam has that voice. And it's almost like the songs are not as important as the voice. Because that voice is iconic. It was brilliant. And it started out so well. We loved working with each other. He had a crush on me. Everything was going great. But, he is barking mad. Yeah. And he was surrounded by guys who just thought, I mean, it was a band, but he basically wanted to be his brother. Right. I mean, it's like he was not the alpha male in Oasis. He was the kid brother, because so when he came to BDI, he sort of wanted to be the guy, but he wasn't. That wasn't his talent, and the rest of the band were sort of spineless. They just wanted to get the paycheck, to be honest. Yeah. So it started off really well, and I, it was at the time when, it sounds a terrible thing. It was Simon Cowell was leaving American Idol, and I had been seriously approached to replace him.
Wow, and really?
I'd done a couple of interviews, and it was like, hang on, we need Steve in Los Angeles because we want him to meet the main guy. So it was like, but we were starting to mix, and I said, look, guys, can I just have my day off on another day, because I need to just fly to LA, do that. Liam just threw a fit and said, if you do that, you're not coming back on this album. But this is something that could change my life. Anyway, I flew to Los Angeles and met with the main producers of American Idol, and I believe them when they say that they would have used me if they'd gone down the route of another business person. But actually, they changed the format, and they had J-Lo and Steven.
Yeah, they went after. Yeah, I was going to say they went after singers after that, didn't they?
Yeah, like Steve that's Tyler, what they did. Like so they didn't. Right. But they said, Steve, honestly, if we'd gone the same with, we would have had you because they loved me. And I think
that's
I could have done it.
amazing.
Yeah.
You would have been great on that. You would have been awesome on that.
I got fired by Liam because
you could put him in the Geddy Lee chapter. You'll be all right. Another question then. Crowded House, Time on Earth, one of my favourite albums. What was it like?
Really?
Working with Neil
He was great. You know what? If you'd say, what style of singer would you put, what style of songwriter would you put Neil Finn in the sort of chancer bracket like Bono or David Byrne, or in the songwriter bracket like Elvis Costello? I would have said he's in the songwriter bracket.
Yes, 100%.
Absolutely not. He's a fucking chancer. I mean, he's making it up as he goes along. Yes.
No way.
It was amazing. Certainly on the album that I worked on, he was a charming man, and but I have to have a shout out. Probably my favorite record I ever made was with Carl Wallinger.
My hero. Which one did you do?
I worked on some songs on Bang.
Wow.
Have you heard the song "Is It Like Today"?
Of course I have. I've gigged it in pubs. I'm the biggest World Party fan in the world. Trust me, Steve.
If you said to me, Steve, what song would you listen to? What song have you listened to the most since you finished? I would say, "Is It Like Today?" Sometimes now I will put that song on and I will go, I need to hear it again. And I will hear it 5 or 6 times. And each time I'm like more immersed in every single aspect of that.
Wow. You've blown my mind.
And you know what? I used to speak to him all the time because he was Facebook. Were you his friend on Facebook?
I met him once, right? I went to his studio when it was above John Henry's. And I went at 10 o'clock at night through a friend and said, I was a big fan. They were like, Carl said, and I phoned him and I just said, hello, I'm Smiley. He went, yeah, do you want to come over? And I stayed because he used to be a night owl, didn't he?
Yeah.
And I think he was just recording, he just started recording the one after, which became Dumbing Up, I think. But obviously, Chris Sharrock was the drummer, who's still my favourite drummer. So the connection, I think Carl Wallinger is one of the greatest singer-songwriters of all time.
Yeah, I would possibly say that he's an underachiever. He was an underachiever.
Oh, million percent.
He never, after he had his stroke, you'd think he'd go, okay, I'm going to
I don't think he could be asked after he wrote She's the One and Robbie made it a massive hit and the money rolled in. I think Carl just went, can't really be bothered anymore, to be honest.
But even for his health, you'd think he'd go, okay, I'll stop smoking. Maybe that's not a good thing, but he never did.
No.
And he was always texting me because I'm 7 hours ahead of you. So it would be like 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at lunchtime, and he would text me. So it was 4 a.m. for him. Right. So and start talking to me about, various things for his studio. And I would say, Carl, have you actually written any songs? Because, I'll do all that when I've got the studio. The studio isn't quite what I want, and this and that. And, he was talk about a pontificator.
Did you ever go to Seaview, Steve, at all? Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, that's where I worked with him, yeah.
Right, because it was an amazing place. It was like the biggest room, and it was just like there was stuff everywhere. It was like it was amazing.
We would sit there together, and we would just talk and smoke joints, and just have such a laugh. And then I would gently say, "Let's run the tape, Carl," and he would run it. There was no computer, so we would. I mean, I remember mixing "Is It Like Today," just like 2 of us hands on there and going,
wow,
I love it.
Man.
It was great. I mean,
I didn't know that. I genuinely didn't know that. And I'm saying, because in my top 5 albums of all time, like it could be one of 4 World Party songs. And also, just to tell you, Kite is in my 5 as well.
Kite.
Kirsty's album.
Yeah, I love Kite.
What an album that is.
It was my favourite album I did with her. My favourite album of hers. Even though I think "In These Shoes" is a great song. If you've ever heard, it's a very funny song. But no, Kite is great because basically with Kite, I would book Townhouse Studio 2 and get as many people in
Mel Gaynor,
Pino, Johnny, Pete Glenister. I would have, and a keyboard player. So I would sometimes have 5 or 6 musicians playing the song. Now, my rule of thumb was we have to keep playing this song until it sounds like a record, because we have enough people here for it to sound like a record.
Right.
And if it didn't sound like a record, someone's part wasn't right. So, we would work on the parts, and then I would never do any overdubs. No overdubs, no patches. I wanted to make I would record like each song 10 times. But because we had a studio at home, I would take the tapes home and I would go through each one and edit the multi-tracks and like comp the band performances.
Right, okay.
And then once I had a really good backing track, I would then do all the vocals with Kirsty. Yeah. And then look at it and go, do we need a tambourine now? Do we need maybe just a little bit of this, a little bit of that? But then the album was done. And thank you for saying that. I
honestly, I've never had the chance to say these things to you, and because it's got a Smiths cover on it, hasn't it?
You just haven't earned it yet, baby.
Again, people out there in Clang World, if you haven't heard Kite by Kirsty MacColl, is one of the greatest albums.
Well, Free World, you've got to get it, you've got to grab it, you've got to get it up.
Amazing. Amazing. I'm going to go listen to it this afternoon.
Actually, but so you mentioned World Party. Is that because one of the things I wanted to get out of you is there an album that you kind of sit there and you go, do you know what? I did that.
No, I mean, I didn't do all of that. I sort of came in and helped. I mean, back in the early days, it was very, you did a whole album. I mean, I was very proud of Big Country. I think the story of Big Country is that they got signed, and they did Briggs signed them, and they did a bunch of recording with Chris Thomas. Yes. Right, who was like, Mr. Sex Pistols, a fantastic record producer. And all of a sudden, what turned out as being like, hey, we've signed this great band, there was this sense of, we're not sure, and the recordings were not great they sounded flat and there was nothing going on there. And Briggs said to me, Steve, can you just go in and do one song with them and see how it goes? And I went in and I gave them, I mean, I must say that I was the touch page. I licked the blue touch, I was the instigator of how they were, because, and it's the greatest thing ever. I did Fields of Fire, right?
Did you do the Crossing then?
Yeah, I did the Crossing.
Then you did Steeltown as well.
Then I did Steeltown, but Fields of Fire, basically, Stuart Adamson got this like light bulb in his head after we recorded that, and I recorded it very differently. I did all the drums one at a time, literally. I mean, Mark Brzezicki is
I know him well.
Oh, he's the greatest hi-hat player I've ever recorded. I would have this hi-hat playing. I would have Phil Collins. I mean, anyway, if you had the perfect drummer, I would have. Yeah. I would have the hi-hat of Mark. But anyway, after doing Fields of Fire, Stuart went away and wrote In a Big Country. Right. So, as a producer, to be able to inspire someone to write a song like that, purely from the sound that he heard,
I'm going to send this to Bruce Watson, because I spoke to him last week.
Oh, give him my love.
I will indeed. He's such a wonderful man, and I didn't realise that I didn't put 2 and 2 together that you were in from the start. I thought you did it later. Amazing. So because the similarity between Sparkle in the Rain and The Crossing, I think there is quite a big. It's very drum orientated, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean,
probably the best 2 drummers in the '80s, if you think about it. Those 2.
Well, you say Sharrock was good, but Sharrock wasn't so much a real heavy hitter.
No, Mel Gaynor and Mark Brzezicki were the '80s boys.
Yeah. Well, Gaynor was probably the loudest I mean, but then Phil Collins for me was probably the best drummer I've ever recorded, because Phil Collins can be Ringo.
Yeah.
And to be Ringo is one of the, he can be Simon Phillips, but Simon Phillips can't be Ringo.
Absolutely right.
Phil
Absolutely
Collins can be Simon Phillips and be Ringo. That's why at his greatest, I think Phil Collins was as good as anyone. Although I did record Abe Laboriel Jr. Do you know who he is?
Really? Yeah, McCartney's drummer.
McCartney's drummer. He was really, really amazing.
He's brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant. And he's got an amazing voice. He does all the high notes.
Oh, yeah. Good.
Wow.
So yeah, but Big Country, The Crossing, back to your question, Pete, that album I was pretty pleased with all the way through. It was.
I've got one more question for you, Steve.
Absolutely.
Which album do you wish you had produced and you didn't?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to ask you.
I mean, just, I was such a David Bowie fan from Hunky Dory on, through Station to Station, Let's Dance.
Yeah.
I mean, anything by Bowie. I did, as I said, I was his A&R man. And
Really?
when I had another failed corporate job when I worked for Columbia Records in New York. And my job was to go and try and convince David to make an album that had, that had some sort of, not commercialness to it, but something, and I remember sitting having tea with David and I was, talking to him about U2, and it's like he told me his favorite U2 album, and it made me think, well, he's not going to aim for that, was Zooropa, which is
a brilliant album, but it's the most uncommercial album ever, isn't it?
I mean, for him, that was his favorite, and I went, I'm going to have to go back to my bosses and go, I'm not sure David's going to deliver what we need,
Man.
But yeah, David Bowie was my favorite, but I was a huge prog fan before punk, before I got my job in a studio. There was a band called Egg, and the album is called The Polite Force. I would recommend you going to listen to Egg, The Polite Force. Okay. It has the most weird time signatures that you've ever heard, but it's
right up your street, then, Pete.
Oh, don't talk to me about time signatures. I'm with you. If it goes beyond 4, forget it.
Well, my favorite joke is I can play in 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
I'm still the person who famously played a track on an archive album, and all these proggers came up and patted me on the back and said, "Amazing, man, how you pulled that 9/8 off." And I looked around and went, 9/8? I played it in 4/4. And everybody thought I was being really clever and putting these fills in this different place, and I was playing it in the wrong time signature.
That's so funny, but yeah.
There you go. We are going to have to wrap this up. This has been an absolute pleasure, Steve. Thank you so much, man. I've learned so much, and I'm going to be badgering you on WhatsApp now with loads of questions about Carl Wallinger, probably.
Oh no, he was beautiful, man, and I'm going to listen to Kite and Is It Like Today again.
Amazing, Steve. Thank you so much, mate.
It just as a closing note, the great thing about this is I said to Smiley when we were doing this, I look through the stuff you did in 70s, 80s, 90s, and it's almost like an entire list of my favourite songs.
There's no greater.
It's kind of like, and we didn't even get to talk about things like the Lars, which is just
Maybe we should do part 2. Maybe we should do Steve part 2 and break our own rules, Pete. If you'd be up for that, Steve, because you haven't touched half of this. All right,
it's up to you. But
okay, this is part 1, folks. Stick around for part 2. We'll do it a future
part 1 of an ongoing series.
Steve, thank you so much, mate.
Clang the Podcast.